Welcome to the second driver focus session on public narrative. Words, palabras, story, historia, narrative, public narrative, narrativa pública. What do these words mean? What stories, if any, live within or behind them? Marshall Gans teaches about public narrative as a primary tool for organizing. He says, stories not only teach us how to act, they inspire us to act. Stories communicate our values through the language of the heart, our emotions. And it is what we feel, our hopes, our cares, our obligations, not simply what we know, that can inspire us with the courage to act. The language we hear in public and the language we use is rooted in our values, experiences, and frames. Conscious or unconscious, these frames structure the conversations we have. The cognitive linguist George Lakoff uses the example of the phrase tax relief to illuminate this concept. For a time, both Democrats and Republicans used this phrase, a win for the conservative strategists who coined this term because the phrase itself constructs the idea that taxes are bad and the public needs to be relieved of them, rather than, say, a message about the value of public investment into public goods. What are the dominant educational narratives in your community, in your state, in your country, across the globe? What values and frames live behind them? Who is generating them? With what intentions? What educational narratives do you think need to be told, elevated, and generated? By whom? Marshall Gans challenges us to author a public narrative. He says, when you do public work, you have a responsibility to offer a public account of who you are, why you do what you do, and where you hope to lead. The thing about it is that if you don't author your public story, others will, and they may not tell it the way you like it, as many recent examples show. Rather than attempting any kind of comprehensive review, the following clips are intended to further provoke your thinking about public narrative as a driver of educational change.
How many people, saw Barack's 2004 speech? So, what do you remember about it?
Humanity.
But specifically, what do you remember about it?
There are no red states. There are no blue
Okay.
Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. The pundits like to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states. Red states for Republicans, blue states for Democrats. But I've got news for them, too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around in our libraries in the red states. We coach Little League in the blue states, and yes, we've got some gay friends in the red states.
Hey, all right. All right. You remember that phrase. Why do you remember that phrase?
Because it hits your heart.
What about it hit your heart?
No division.
So this value of unity, this value of community, of connectedness is what, and that's an important value to you. All right? Yes?
I was adding on to that, sorry.
You can add on to it.
Well, I was just saying that
You need to talk so everybody can hear.
it was kind of radical in this election in which we were talking about we have to beat Bush and we have to, beat the Republicans. And when he just kind of talked about uniting, I just thought that was really memorable.
So you like the power of love as opposed to the power of fight, huh? No, I'm not kidding. I mean, if you really talk about what the core value is there in connectedness and community and interdependence, I mean, that's what we're talking about. Yes?
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2. although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are.
The fast way of thinking is the primary processor. The fast way of thinking is always on. And what the fast way of thinking is always doing is trying to immediately construct a coherent narrative based on whatever new piece of information it receives. And guess what we call on unconsciously in constructing that coherent narrative? Our available cache of memories and emotions. So we saw something that wasn't there. We see things that aren't there all the time. We are constant meaning makers. We are story constructors. And if we know that this is how our brain works, and if we know that what is fueling those stories are memories and emotions, this changes everything about what we do. Everything. Your students are doing this the moment they walk into your classroom. Think about the potential power of being able to harness, direct, and use this understanding of the brain to prepare our children to be lifelong citizens in a democracy and to explicitly and specifically identify what that is and what that looks like.